Hi, welcome back to the Busy Corner. This is lesson 3. We are going to make this ribbed knit scarf. I'm wearing long ribbed knit scarf with this fringe. I made this with Hometown USA. It's a Lion brand, and it is in the shade Washington Denim. You are going to need 2 skeins, and these are 81-yard skeins. So I used the whole thing, double-stranded, to make this scarf. And then I added at the bottom some fringe with some of the leftover yarn and a little bit of novelty yarn. I made this on the medium pipes, so it was the 5 1/4 inch circumference pipes. I'm going to start it on some smaller pipes though, simply because we're going to switch to a piece that's farther along in progress, so I have the medium pipes on that. That's neither here nor there. So I've already cast on your 10 stitches. We covered that in the first 2 videos. And while I was making this the other day, I actually had several brainstorms. And one is that I keep calling this front stitch the knit stitch. In fact, the opposite is true. There's an explanation on my second video. And the fact is, when I taught myself to do this, I was standing behind the pipes just like they were my arms, because I had to figure out how to transpose arm work to these. Sitting in front, you've reversed your position and therefore the stitch. And that's all really a purl stitch is in knitting. It's the reverse of a knit stitch. So I also discovered that since you're combining the knit and purl stitches when you do a rib knit scarf like this one, which is reversible, and again, you're just reversing the stitch, you don't need to twist that first one on the end. So you'll see that I don't do that. So let's start out with a front stitch, because I think it's easier to begin the row this way. I also put on 10 stitches, and I told you the other day odd numbers work better. And that's true unless you pick a certain even number. So 10 works. If you begin a row with 10 stitches in the knit or purl stitch, you end with the same stitch you started with. So that way you can begin the next row with the same. It's easier to keep track of. So 10 works. I put 10 on, and you can work out the numbers when you're making something, as far as when you're doing a rib knit, because they have to follow in a line. And you'll see that when we get to the piece that has more in progress. So here's our 10 stitches. We're going to begin with the front stitch, which is in fact a purl stitch as it faces you when you see the work coming out. Anyway, you are going to take off that cast on stitch. You are going to put your stitch through, and don't twist it this time. Just put it on straight. It still looks better when you're working the stockinette, but it's unnecessary when you're doing this. Make your second stitch is a front stitch or the purl stitch. Bring this up. Now you're going to make a back stitch, which in fact in this position is your knit stitch. So bring your loop off, and however you want to do that, whatever is comfortable, you're going to work out something that is the best for you. But you don't want to drop your stitches. It's harder to recover when they're big and loopy like this. And bring that down. Now you're going to make another back stitch. You bring your loop off, bring the working yarn through, put it on the pipe, make a front stitch. You're going to pull that stitch off, go through the front of the stitch, put the stitch on, make another front stitch. Now you're going to make 2 back stitches. Here's your first one. Bring that loop off, put the working yarn through, just like this. Bring that down in front of the pipe and put it on just like that. So I'm stepping on them. You want to make sure, by the way, that your working yarn doesn't have tension on it. It's easier to do. Now you're going to make your next back stitch. Up comes the yarn, and you're already starting to see something develop. And that is your knit row. So next, your front stitch, which is your purl stitch, and another purl stitch, front stitch. Now you have your first row completed. And you're going to go back and forth. You're going to begin this row with the same stitch you ended with, which is the front stitch. And as you go along, eventually, it's going to start looking like this. Okay, so it doesn't matter This is a medium pipe now, and this is a Woolies yarn. It's 10 stitches. It's just a little farther along than the beginning of the one I showed you. So we're going to put this on now so you can see how this fabric has developed as you've worked along. So you'll see that indeed it's reversible, and you can see that there are, I think you can see that, on one side there are 3 columns of knitting, and the other side, well, this is the one with 2. This side has 3. So now you're going to begin this row, and you know you're going to begin it with a knit stitch. So bring this off, just like you always start a row. Bring it off, but instead of twisting it, you're just going to put it on. You're going to keep it as a knit stitch. Bring off the second stitch. Again, you're working with 2 strands. Now, your next stitch should be a back stitch. And in fact, that is your knit stitch. And if you look at your fabric now, you're going to see when you pull this off, not only will you see the bow tie that I showed you in lesson 2, you're going to see that all these little, what they call V's in knitting, are lining up. You can see that before you even remove the stitch by looking at the front of my fabric. Now that I have it out and it's got some length to it, I can see that these next 2 stitches have to be back stitch or knit stitch. So come in through the back. I got my yarn turned here. You want to keep your working yarn to the inside of those pipes there. Take off your next stitch. It's a back stitch. Now this next stitch, you know, it's got to be a front stitch. You have the purl side, which is what they call the bump. It's a little more recessed, you see, in a ribbed fabric. And you're not going to see the bow tie that I showed you in lesson 2. So if you've lost your place, just look at your fabric. So now you're back to a front stitch and a front stitch. You're going to do another back stitch. Again, look for the bow tie or just look at your fabric. When you're first starting, your first couple rows, the pattern will not be so evident. It's easier to look for that little bow tie sign, I call it. But when you've gotten this far, you can actually just follow the V's. So now you're going to do your knit stitch or your back stitch. You're going to do that twice. And now your last 2 stitches are front stitches. And you're going to do that every row until it's the length you want or until you run out of yarn. You keep an eye on your balls there. You want to save a little bit for your fringe. You don't need to sew the ends together, obviously, but you will, when you get to the end, you will want to tie that off, and you'll find this is your beginning of this scarf. This is where you did your slip stitches you cast on. You're going to find that you can pull this and it gets tighter. So you're going to want to retie this through with a crochet hook. I even knot it, frankly, so that it doesn't pull tighter. And on the other end, that's not necessary when you bind off. So let's go ahead and assume that it is the length you want. By the way, once it gets about this long, it starts to get heavy. And sometimes it'll pull the stitches right out of your hand, the weight of that work. You might just want to drape it up onto your microphone stand. If it gets caught, you know, it'll pull one of these loops, but that doesn't matter. You know, you just straighten it up with your fingers. So use that or a little table underneath to support the weight of that piece. Now let's go ahead and you would continue to do that. I just wanted to show you how those V's line up. That's what they call in knitting, little V's. So now we're going to bind off, and you need to bind off in the same order that you are in the same type of stitch that you put them on with. And we know I goofed that up last time, so we'll see if I can do it this time. So you're going to start with your front stitch, because you have to stitch a front stitch where a front stitch was. Off it comes. You're not going to turn these. I didn't turn them on this piece. And actually, I think that looks better on the end. This I did turn, and you see it has the little loopy knot. So I think it looks better not to do that. So there's your first stitch, which was a front stitch. Here's another stitch, which is a front stitch. you have 2 on, bind 1 off. Your net stitch has to be the knit stitch. Yep, there's your V's. There's your bow tie. Put your knit stitch on, or your back stitch. Snug it up. Bind off the previous stitch. Take this off. You're going to make another knit stitch. There's your V's. Go through the back. Pull up your working yarn. Place it on the pipe. 2 on, 1 off. Slip it right over. Your next stitch are going to be front stitches. You can see that's the purl stitch with the bump. Through the front, put it on, snug it up, 2 on, 1 off. Here's another front stitch. 2 on, 1 off. We're going to be back to a back stitch. We'll double check. Yep, look, when I hold that up, it makes it even more visible. There's your V's. Here's your bow tie. B for bow tie, B for back stitch. Snug it up, cast it off. Next is the same. It's another back stitch, knit stitch. Pull it up, bring it off, and your last 2, of course, are the front stitches, just like you began the row. And that's why this works out. You don't have to switch back and forth every time. Okay. Look, I did it again. Oh, shoot. Now, here, I made a mistake. So, you know what? You can fix this mistake. Take off the stitch you just made. Hold it in your hand. Grab this yarn. Release the working yarn. Keep a hold of this. Put it back up there. That's how you fix a mistake. If you do it stitch by stitch and you catch yourself right away, you can fix it just like I did. Now bind off. Now we'll make our stitch. That was pretty funny. Okay. And off it comes. And then you're going to pull this through all the way, you know, and cut it. Then, if you want to, when you pull that through, leave enough length that that's the beginning of your fringe, and you're just going to go through then along your edge. I like to put my fringe through the whole stitch, not just half the stitch. So kind of pull this down, and you'll see these V's. And I think it looks better to put the fringe right through that V stitch. And again, on the other end where you worked the slip stitch, this will continue to pull and be tight. So either with your finger or a crochet hook, you're going to want to pull that through, and you could even just pull 1 strand through. Leave the one where it is and do a double knot there. And you're finished after you've added your fringe. Thanks for watching. Next time we will make a garter stitch shawl.